In 1953, the newly crowned Queen Elizabeth II reviewed her armed services in a series of spectacular displays of pageantry and military might. On July the 15th that year, it was the turn of the Royal Air Force to impress the monarch. The location was RAF Odium in Hampshire. The service was at the peak of its peacetime strength since the war, with a total of 6,338 aircraft. It was by any measure an impressive display, and as Her Royal Highness proceeded down the immaculately presented lines of aircraft, even the most casual of observer could not have failed to notice that the RAF had well and truly entered the jet age.
I think the Air Force has always been a bit underconfident because, of course, the RAF has always been, for a long time, has been under threat of absorption by the other two services. And I think the Coronation Review, quite above anything else, spelled the end of that. Here we were on the ground, covering the ground, with hundreds and hundreds of operational aeroplanes and saying, this is our Spithead Review. This is our Aldershot tattoo. You know, come to Odium and have a look at us. We're here and we're going to say. There was that. There was sort of confidence and self-assertive kind of a mood about it all.
Fighter Command had been flying jets since 1944 with the Gloucester Meteor. Now the RAF had Meteor Mark 4s and 8s, as well as the much-needed two-seat trainer, the Mark 7. There were also de Havilland Vampires and North American F-86 Sabres on loan from the United States, until the arrival of the Supermarine Swift and Hawker Hunter. Bomber Command was about to pension off its aging fleet of Avro Lincolns and borrowed Boeing B-29 Washingtons. Now it had the superb English Electric Canberra. And soon the V-Force, consisting of the Vickers Valiant, Avro Vulcan and Handley Page Victor, would be on hand to carry Britain's nuclear deterrent. The RAF was at the height of its power. Not only was it the largest and most powerful air force in the world, second only to the United States Air Force, but it was the most forward-looking, fed by a hungry and imaginative aircraft industry.
Well, I think it was still in its wartime rundown state, and it was an incredibly capable industry. Right across the board, aircraft, engines, airframes, military and civil. And a lot of prototypes were emerging from the various well-known companies like de Havillands and Hawkers and Gloucesters. It was a very, very interesting period to be around.
Well, I think in many ways it was quite pioneering, and but I think, as I say, many things against it. I think one was always lack of suitable or adequate funds, and projects tended to overrun their budgets, and again, building two of the same thing was probably wasting money up to extent.
Progress had indeed been rapid. Only 9 years previously, in 1944, the Gloucester Meteor had become the first Allied jet aircraft to enter service. Initially, one squadron, number 616, was equipped with Meteor Mark 1s to help in the fight against the V-1 flying bombs which were terrorizing the civilian population in the southeast of England. The Mark 1 was powered by two Rolls-Royce Welland turbojet engines, which had been developed from Sir Frank Whittle's design. With a top speed of around 415 miles an hour, the Mark 1's performance was little better than the best piston-engined fighters of the day. But the Air Ministry was sufficiently confident in the success of the jet fighter that the decision was made to develop a new Mark, the Mark III, even before the 20 Mark 1s had been completed. Initially, the Mark III had to make do with the same Welland engine as its predecessor, but by January 1945, 616 Squadron received the new Mark III powered by Rolls-Royce Derwent engines. With the new type came a move to Belgium, where the squadron was attached to the 2nd Tactical Air Force and tasked to fly ground attack sorties. They were joined by a 2nd Meteor Squadron, number 504. At the back of many people's minds was the possibility that the Meteors might come up against the Germans' first operational jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me-262, but it was not to be. The Mark III remained in service until 1948, when it was replaced by the Mark IV. The Mark IV was faster and stronger than the previous Marks, having uprated Derwent engines which gave it a top speed of 580 miles an hour at 10,000 feet.
The first Meteors had what they call a short squat nacelle, which limited the maximum speed, the Mach number. And then they brought out what they call the long-nose Meteor, very much extended pods with the engines in, which increased the limiting Mach number considerably.
2 years later, the Mark IVs were superseded by the Mark VIII, which became the RAF's primary day interceptor from 1950 to 55. The F-8 equipped 19 fighter command squadrons, as well as 10 squadrons of the Royal Auxiliary Air Force. The de Havilland DH-100 Vampire was the RAF's second jet fighter to enter service and was also Britain's first single-jet aircraft. Remarkably, it took just 16 months from the commencement of detailed drawing to first flight in September 1943. It was powered by de Havilland's own turbojet design, the Goblin, which had begun life as an alternative to Whittle's engine at a time when it had been beset by production problems during 1941 to 42, before Rolls-Royce intervened. Although diminutive in size and despite modest performance, the Vampire would become a popular aircraft.
I was still in the Air Force in 1944 when I was asked to go and fly the earliest Vampire that was then at Farnborough. And that was the first jet that I flew. And there's no shadow of doubt that it was a marvelous way to be driven through the sky by a jet, extremely smooth and rather fast.
Well, as a first aircraft, I was very impressed. First of all, being a jet, it was very smooth. There was no vibration, having been flying Griffins for quite a long time, which was a pretty robust vibrating bit of machinery. To have this dead smooth power there with tremendous acceleration on the takeoff, and sitting up in the cockpit, where instead of having a couple of tons of machinery in front of you and so you couldn't see much, you had a marvelous view of the runway. And flying the aircraft was dead smooth, and it was a real pleasure.
The Vampire was by far the pleasantest and most nicely balanced of the two to fly. It was a kind of jet-propelled Tiger Moth. Small, light, responsive, terribly intimate. I mean, you know, your shoulders were almost wider than the fuselage, and a lovely aeroplane. If you had to have a little jet aeroplane of your own to run, I would choose either the Vampire or the Seahawk, I think. It was really lovely. The Meteor, on the other hand, was big, heavy by comparison. 2 motors with all that entailed. Not as responsive by any means as the Vampire, but of course a much more capable airplane in terms of performance. The Vampire had 3,000 pounds of thrust, the Meteor had 2 times 3,500 pounds of thrust, so there was a lot more performance there.
But the Vampire did not enter RAF service until 1946. Number 247 Squadron was the first to receive them, with 54 and 72 squadrons joining 247 at RAF Odium to form the first Vampire wing in September 1946.
I actually converted from the latest, or the last of the Spitfires, straight onto Vampires jets. That was in Hong Kong, and that was in 1950. I had grown to love the Spitfire we were flying then, which once again was a fighter reconnaissance aeroplane. It was the Mark 18 with the Griffon engine, with a superb performance and so on. But time goes by, and of course everything changes. And the powers that be said the Spitfire has run its course, and you're getting Vampires. Well, this was wildly exciting at the time because this was the way things were. This was the pointed end. When it came to actually transferring and converting onto the aircraft, I found it to be an extremely simple task to do this. My surprise was that in getting into a Vampire, you had suddenly got an airplane where you sat in the nose. The world was lying at your feet. You didn't have to dodge past 11 feet of Rolls-Royce engine. That it was quiet in the air, and it was remarkably easy to fly. And it didn't have anything like the bits and pieces we used to enjoy in the Spitfire, like mixture controls and pitch controls and things that you could play around with and alter the sound of the engine and so on. It was like a tiger moth. It had an engine, it had a throttle. You started the engine, you took off at full throttle, you climbed at full throttle, and you chose your own power setting when you were up there. So it just seemed absurdly simple at the time. So a lot of the interest went out of it in a way, going on to jets.
Development of the type continued with the Mark III, replacing the older versions in RAF service in 1948. The Mark III formed the basis of export versions, which were sold and manufactured under license in Norway, Canada, and Australia. The Vampire's potential was underlined further when, in 1948, 6 aircraft from 54 Squadron made the first transatlantic jet flight under their own power. Other records were set by the Vampire, which helped keep it in the public eye.
The record-breaking Vampire came in for a great deal of interest from Italians at Ciampino Airfield, Rome. Flown by Mr. John Derry, de Havilland test pilot, the machine had travelled non-stop at a high altitude from Hatfield, covering the 916 miles in 2 hours, 50 minutes, 40 seconds, an average of 323 miles an hour. A demonstration of its wonderful flying qualities was given over the Rome airport. It's reported that there is a possibility of Vampire jet planes being produced under license by Italian firms.
Royal Air Force Vampires were very much on the spot. Here, south of Blomberg, they catch a trainload of tanks.
The Vampire was also proving to be potent in the ground attack role. A new version of the Mark III was produced with slightly shorter, strengthened wings so that it could carry underwing stores. This version became the FB Mark V and won many export orders around the world.
Just one more demonstration of the vital importance of command in the air.
Vampire and its successor, the Venom, were seen as ground attack airplanes, as tank-busting airplanes, if you like. Whereas the Meteors were seen as air defense airplanes only. There was never a ground attack version of the Meteor except a private venture by Gloucesters. The Air Force had no interest in a ground attack Meteor, simply because the Vampire was the more agile thing. It was the kind of airplane you'd want to be here, squeezing around among tanks near the ground.
By the late 1940s, de Havilland had begun work on a new fighter-bomber, which would be powered by the new, more powerful Ghost engine. The DH-112 was designated the Vampire FB Mark 8, but the design was so extensively changed that it was redesignated as the Venom. One of the most noticeable features that identified the Venom easily from the Vampire was the shape of its wing. This had a straight trailing edge instead of the tapered wings of the Vampire. It was also of thinner section and was equipped to carry jettisonable wingtip fuel tanks. Its armament was the same as the Vampire, 4 20mm Hispano cannon mounted in the belly. It was also able to carry up to 2,000 pounds of bombs. The new Ghost turbojet produced 4,850 pounds of thrust, which could push the Venom along at 640 miles an hour, which was a substantial improvement over the Vampire's 540 miles an hour. The type first flew at Hatfield in September 1949 and became operational with the RAF 3 years later in August 1952. "19 RAF squadrons in Germany, the Near and Far East were equipped with the Venom, and it won many export orders from air forces all over the world. The Venom was later modified to accommodate extra radar and a radar navigator in an enlarged cockpit. This variant entered service from 1953 as an interim night fighter. By the end of the 1940s, the first-line squadrons that made up RAF Fighter Command were almost entirely equipped with jets. Those squadrons still operating the last piston-engined aircraft were converting as soon as the new jets could be delivered.
As soon as I got back from India, having been flying DC-3s, I was about a week late for the start of the test pilots school. And the second day I was there, I think, they said, well, you missed a week's lectures on how these jets and things work, but you've got to fly one, so in you go and off you go. And I must say, it was the most intriguing experience, because although the aeroplane itself is extremely simple to fly, the jet handling, of course, was extraordinary to anybody who had never done it before. And the only instruction we really received on it was a hand on the shoulder and said, for goodness sake, watch your jet pipe temperatures, which must not go over whatever they were. And off we went. But it was a strange, strange experience, I must admit.
Training new jet pilots was potentially fraught with difficulty, as initially there were no dual-seat jets.
There was no dual version of the Vampire, and Vampire pilots were trained by bringing them up in Meteors and sending them solo, in fact, once in a Meteor. And then you sat them in a Vampire, and tipped it up onto its main wheels with its nose wheel off the ground and said, "About there for landing," and patted him encouragingly on the back, and off he went. And that worked very well.
The lack of a dual-seat jet trainer was greatly alleviated by the arrival of the Meteor T7 in RAF service in 1948. Originally begun as a private venture by Gloucesters, the T7 was based on the Mark IV with an extended fuselage to accommodate the enlarged cockpit. The aircraft was a great success, and over 700 were built for the RAF and Navy, as well as winning orders from overseas air forces. In 1952, the RAF began to take delivery of the new Vampire T Mark 11 trainer. The cockpit was basically the Mosquito cockpit grafted onto the Vampire airframe.
Well, it was very uncomfortable. I didn't go much on it at all. We had in the past, as I said, been training these young men on the Meteor 7 to the point of them going solo and then giving them a pat on the back and sending them off in the Vampire with no duel. And so everybody was supposed to be glad that this dual version of the Vampire was coming in, but when it did come in, it was a gross disappointment. It was introduced with no ejector seats, which seemed ridiculous. Not only that, but it had a flat lid on the cockpit, which would have been very difficult to get out of wearing a parachute on your bottom and with no ejector seat. It was narrow across the shoulders, and the student and the instructor, whilst they could see clearly what one another was doing, were fairly inhibited in terms of their movement in the cockpit. And of course, although it did, I seem to remember, have an extra 500 pounds of thrust compared to the single-seat version, it was very sluggish. Not really a great success, but there we are. It was a side-by-side jet trainer that we were able to use right through for many, many years. It's just that it could have been so much better in the original concept.
Well, I spent a lot of time instructing on the Vampire T11, which quite remarkably was the tiny Vampire fighter which had been stretched to take 2 people. I found that quite a stimulating business. I was actually a squadron commander, so I was looking after 2 courses at once. The syllabus was very extensive. And I think has since been changed considerably. But in those days, they tried to make everybody into a fighter pilot, whether they wanted to be one or not, in the first place. It wasn't, looking back on it, it wasn't really required. Why should a person whose ambition was to fly a Nimrod, why should he have to be able to do high-level aerobatics at 35,000 feet and so on? But that's the way it was, and everybody had to pass every facet of the course. And of course, you always had a percentage who simply weren't built to do that. And it was always a matter of deep regret to me when I had to scrub a chap, simply because he couldn't do a particular exercise at high level, for instance.
And here's the 535, the Swift prototype, a swept-back wing fighter developed from the Attacker. Seen here side by side at a preview before Farnborough, they make an impressive picture of streamlined speed and power.
The Supermarine Swift had started life in 1946, when the Air Ministry began the process of looking for a replacement for the Gloucester Meteor. The Type 535 was the version which would enter RAF service in August 1952. It was powered by the Rolls-Royce Avon 114 turbojet, which meant that the Swift was capable of 685 miles an hour at sea level.
And now the Vickers Swift, a descendant, as it were, of the Spitfire.
But despite the impressive displays at Farnborough and detail improvements on later versions, the Swift was not a success in the interceptor role and was withdrawn from first-line use as early as 1955. The disappointment of the Swift was partially alleviated by the fact that the RAF had ordered one of the best jet fighters of the post-1945 decade, the North American F-86 Sabre.
The real reason for getting the Sabres across was because the Vampires, Venoms, Meteors were all out of date, really. Meteor night fighters, all sorts of things like that. And it moved the Air Force into the swept wing power control fighter jet area, transonic jets, because the Hunter wasn't quite yet ready. It was coming along, but it wasn't there. And so we got into the swept wing era about a year or two before we otherwise would have done so.
When you let go of the brakes, the aeroplane leapt off the brakes. That was a new experience for those of us who'd flown rounded corner airplanes with fat tires. This had, there was a lot more thrust there, and you felt it because everything was slicker. And it had fully powered controls, of course, which Vampires didn't have. They were flew by cable, whereas the Sabre had a fully duplicated hydraulic flying control system. So as soon as he got off the ground on his first solo, and there was no dual version of the Sabre, as soon as he got off the ground on his first solo, the Sabre pilot did a lot of this stuff while he learned about the pitch control. He didn't get an opportunity to learn that until he was 50 feet above the ground on his first solo. Suddenly he realized it. And the trick, of course, was to leave the stick alone.
By the time the Canadian-built examples had arrived in RAF service, the Sabre was a 10-year-old aeroplane, but it had proven itself in combat in the skies over Korea, and any initial problems inherent in early versions of a new type had long since been ironed out. The Sabre was the RAF's first supersonic jet. The combination of its performance, coupled with the experience of pilots who'd flown in jet combat over Korea, led to changes in tactics.
Because it was so much slicker, we could now get, and because we could get higher, we could now come in from above these Washington squadrons, you see, and we could go down through them and up again. We could yo-yo up and down through the enemy formations, and that was an amount of maneuver, amount of inertia, an amount of stored energy that you never had on the thick-winged Vampire Meteor pair. But on the Sabre, it was very maneuverable in pitch at high altitudes, that was entirely new.
430 Sabres were delivered to the RAF, but by 1957 they'd all been replaced by another truly great aircraft, the Hawker Hunter.
Ah, the Hunter, my love. The Hunter came in, and at that particular time I had been transferred from Benson, the ferry business, to Bruggen, where the Sabres were. And the Hunter came in, and the Hunter was absolutely a dream aeroplane to fly. It fitted you like a glove and would do anything. You almost had to think what you want done, and the Hunter would do it for you.
The first production Hunter first flew in May 1953 and entered RAF service in July the following year as the F Mark I. Powered by the Rolls-Royce Avon, it was the first of what would become Britain's most successful post-war military aircraft. It was also Britain's first military aircraft capable of supersonic flight, albeit in a shallow dive. A Mark II version was also produced, based on the Mark I, but powered by the Armstrong-Siddeley Sapphire engine. But the early Marks were prone to problems of engine surge when firing their guns at altitude.
The Hunter started off in Mark I and II form with the two different engines, with a lot of very basic faults. Cabin conditioning, demisting, de-icing of the cockpit, engine surging on the engine. Once we had developed it for 2 or 3 years, with the Air Force and Boscombe Down taking part, the big Avon engine was put in it, and that transformed the aeroplane. All the other shortcomings were put rightable. Very, very simply, it was just a matter of time and money. But in Mark IX form, I think it was probably one of the best engine-airframe combinations, which stood up to anything the pilot would give it. He could slam the engine around, he could fire his guns up to 50,000 feet. It was a very highly developed airplane. And of course we sold it to 20 countries overseas, and it was in service with 22 air forces. And if we had more time and more airframes, we could have sold a lot more of them.
The Hunter's reputation was greatly enhanced when, in September 1953, Neville Duke set a new world speed record, flying a Mark III powered by an Avon with afterburner.
Neville Duke, flying a Hawker Hunter jet fighter from Tangmere, has set up a new world airspeed record, subject, of course, to official confirmation. Checking the time at these modern high-speed bids is quite a complicated affair, as you can see, and 4 flights have to be made, 2 in each direction. Duke did this twice in one day, flying low above the sea off the Sussex coast. At the second attempt, he achieved an average speed of 727.6. His wife, watching from a beach, must have been thrilled to see him do the victory roll when it was all over. And certainly his daring and successful bid was a really magnificent achievement.
The Mark VI was the most produced version and began equipping squadrons in 1956 and had become the standard day fighter by 1958. Like its predecessor, the Mark IV, the Mark VI could carry a variety of stores on pylons under its wings. This meant that the 430mm Aden cannon could be supplemented with Britain's first guided air-to-air missile, the Fairey Fireflash. The problem of the engine ingesting spent ammunition casings that had dogged the earlier versions was solved by adding 2 bulges under the engine intakes. They soon became known throughout the service as Sabrinas.
Sabrina was a big-breasted young lady in the entertainment world somewhere, probably Sunday night at the London Palladium on TV. And so if you just stood underneath the Hunter and looked up and half closed your eyes, you could definitely see Sabrina. And they were called Sabrinas for that reason. And everybody called them Sabrinas. I've no doubt they were called Link, capsules, Link collection, or something, but we all called them Sabrinas. Everybody knew what we were talking about.
At the same time as the Mark VI was entering service, a dual-seat trainer version, the T Mark VII, was also being introduced. A total of 1,972 Hunters of various types were produced right up until 1966. It's a testament to the Hunter's greatness that it was operated by 22 air arms around the world, some flying their aircraft well into the 1990s. Amazingly, 40 years after it first flew, 20% of all the Hunters ever built were still flying. In the decade after 1945, fighters were specified for specific roles: day, night, and in the late 40s, all weather. Night fighting duties were being carried out by the Meteor NF-11, which was now being built by Armstrong Whitworth. The NF-11 was created out of the marriage of the T-7 cockpit section with the Mark 8 tail. The wing was similar to that of the Mark I, but was modified to house 4 20mm cannon displaced from the nose. The nose was extended to accommodate the radar systems required for this kind of role. The variant was developed further up to a Mark 14, with uprated radar systems and a clear view canopy. In anticipation that the RAF would need a replacement, de Havilland had taken its distinctive twin-boom theme a stage further with the twin-engined DH-110. Although the RAF considered the DH-110 for the all-weather role, it was passed over in favour of the Gloucester Javelin.
It had its handling problems, but I think the Vixen had perhaps the higher performance with its particular layout, with its fairly large tail on two booms.
But back to fighters for the RAF. Here's the Gloucester.
The Javelin was powered by two Armstrong Siddeley Sapphires, but it was its distinctive Delta wing that made the Javelin so easily recognisable. It was the world's first twin-engine Delta-wing jet to enter operational service. Although the prototype had first flown in November 1951, the Javelin's development into an operational aeroplane had been fraught with problems.
Very odd airplane. I remember Bill Wharton warned me, he said, you know, you try flying it slowly. He said the slower you get, the more you have to push the stick forward until you're getting to the point where nearly running out. He said, goodness sake, don't get to there, otherwise you'll spin in. It's really quite frightening, you know, sort of slower and slower, pushing the stick further and further forward.
In 1956, RAF squadrons began receiving the first Javelins, and although it was developed through 9 variants, the Javelin could not be regarded as an outstanding success.
Well, it had, I think it had three real main problems. One was that the wings were too fat to make it go much above 0.9 Mach number, so that we spent endless money in flights trying to stick vortex generators and things around the wings in order to get rid of the buffet at a high Mach number. The stalling characteristics were pretty bad, which was another one. And the final thing, the one that really made the whole project pretty useless, was of course the radar. And it was designed as an all-weather night fighter. And to be successful at that, of course, you needed the latest in radar. We never got the collision course radar installed in it. Right up to the end, we were still using virtually a wartime tail chase radar.
I flew it when I was on the examining wing of the Central Flying School, when we used to fly everything there was in the Air Force and in the Navy with our CFS examining wing ticket. The Javelin was a great cumbersome beast. We called it the Gloucester Dragmaster, and it had a couple of Armstrong Siddeley Sapphire engines in the back, and it was about all they could do to push it along, really.
Throughout the late 1940s and into the 50s, the world was largely divided by 2 dominant political ideologies, those for or against communism. The pro-communism faction was led by China and Russia, while the fight against communism was led by the United States, with Britain playing a key role in Europe and the Middle East. Tensions rose dramatically when the Russians sealed off all access to Berlin in June 1948. It took a massive airlift of vital supplies to the beleaguered West Berliners before the blockade was lifted the following year. But Western Europe would have to face the Soviet threat for decades to come. Initially, it was feared that whilst the West was licking its wounds after the end of the Second World War, Russia might launch a large-scale conventional attack. As Fighter Command's task was the aerial defense of Britain, it had to address some fundamental issues. Were there enough aircraft to oppose large numbers of Russian bombers? What was the state of Britain's air defense systems? The decision was taken to make great efforts to bring the air defense system up to scratch, reopen radar stations, provide more manpower, and form additional squadrons. Massive exercises were carried out with Boeing B-29s of the United States Air Force and Lancasters and Lincolns of RAF Bomber Command acting as the enemy.
The fourth type of attack I want to demonstrate to you is the frontal beam attack. In this case, the fighter positions himself 5 miles ahead, 3,000 yards out on a parallel course. He turns toward the B-29. Tracking is started at 1 o'clock at a range of 2,000 yards. He opens fire at 1,200 yards at 2 o'clock and continues until 4 o'clock at 700 yards. The fixed gun sight had to be used with a deflection of between 4.5 and 5 radii. We found that the Meteor 4 was unsuitable for this form of attack due to its inability to track the B-29 below 1,000 yards. The Vampire, with its better maneuverability, could track the B-29 down to 700 yards. It was also found that the fighter presented a very difficult target to the bomber. This attack, however, was found to be very difficult for the pilot to execute without considerable practice. For these reasons, this attack is not recommended.
Of course, when I was an ordinary fighter pilot on a fighter squadron, the annual exercise would come up regularly, and it was an exciting time. You often got detached. I can remember one called Exercise Beware, where we were detached to an airfield that was practically disused, and part of the exercise was to regenerate it and so on. So yes, the annual exercises were really quite demanding, and one of the things you never forget is doing head-on attacks against Washington. So if you're an air defense fighter chap, you can well remember being up there at 36 or 40,000 feet, contrailing like mad, and looking ahead, you can see coming towards you phalanxes of B-29 superfortresses also trailing like mad. And the idea was to make a quick head-on attack for about 3 seconds and then dodge underneath this mass of bombers. This mass formation business was, as we understood it, the way the Russians planned to operate the Tu-4, which was what they called the Washington, or B-29. They planned to come along in line abreast so as to give us a major problem. And it would have been a major problem for us because there wasn't much time that you were in range before you were in collision. So that seemed to be based on good intelligence about the Russians' intentions, and that was what we were practicing against, out there in the middle of the North Sea somewhere. It bristled with guns. That was one of the difficulties about attacking it. Secondly, there wasn't much attacking time. If you were to avoid the guns, you had to do it head-on. And if you were going to do it head-on, you had a very, very short time to fire your guns before you hit the enemy anyway. And thirdly, of course, because of the way they flew, there was a great deal of mutual support in terms of their multitude of guns. And so, yes, it was a very difficult target.
Bombing up Washingtons, which are American B-29s taken over by the RAF, is just one angle on Exercise Pinnacle. And Exercise Pinnacle is the biggest test of Britain's air defences held since the war. Mock attacks have been carried out on different areas by night and day in a full-scale peacetime battle that has been fought out over many days.
And I think the period from 1945 to the end of the 40s was a period where the Air Force was putting up with the new jet aeroplanes, because they're jet aeroplanes, and everybody needed that sort of speed, and so these airplanes had actually outpaced the fastest piston engine fighters. Having said that, I think we would have been badly placed if a war had occurred at that time, because I don't think they would have been found to be very effective. From the 50s onwards, the Hunters came into service, which was a very, very fine subsonic fighter. The Americans had the Sabre, which was a very fine subsonic fighter, and the British started to have the Canberra, which was the world's best twin-engine jet bomber. So it all changed pattern from difficulties and mediocrity in the late 40s to getting to grips with the world's best aeroplanes by the 50s.
In the ops room, the work is as realistic as if a modern Battle of Britain were being fought.
Fox 3240, 3240, hostile 235, 3 plus at 22.
And here another raiding force is attacked, Meteors intercepting Lancasters. Exercise Pinnacle is secret, but we may be sure it has proved of the greatest value.
But RAF Bomber Command was about to gain a distinct advantage. There had been those who had been campaigning for a different approach to bomber thinking since before the war.
Well, Captain de Havilland realized that if an aeroplane was going to be fast and do its job successfully, it had to be streamlined, fairly lightish weight, and not carry a lot of heavy armament with it if it was going to have a high performance. So he didn't feel at all happy with the requirements for heavy armament on the bombers with gun turrets and large crews. Well, eventually he persuaded the Air Ministry to allow him to go ahead and to build what turned out to be the Mosquito, which was perhaps the fastest and most successful wartime designed and developed aeroplane that we had in the 39-45 war.
As we now know, the Mosquito was one of the most successful aircraft ever built, and not surprisingly, the Air Ministry was eager to have a jet-powered version as soon as possible. The result was the English electric Canberra, which first flew in May 1949. As with all aircraft destined for long-term production, it was perfect first time out. The first RAF Canberra was delivered to 101 Squadron in May 1951. As with the Mosquito, the Canberra was designed to operate both fast and high enough to dispense with defensive armament. It easily fulfilled the design concept. Its speed and altitude put it way beyond RAF Fighter Command's Meteors and Vampires, scrambled to intercept the Canberras in exercises.
With the Canberra, in 1950, we doubled the performance of Bomber Command, which at that time had 300-mile-per-hour Lincolns. The Canberra was a 600-mile-per-hour airplane. The Lincoln was maximum operating altitude was around about 27,000 feet. The Canberra had an operating altitude of 50,000 feet and a ceiling of 55,000 feet. And so it was a quantum jump forward. And when the Royal Air Force, the rather unsuspecting Air Force, started to re-equip with Canberras in 1952, they exchanged their Lincolns, their lumbering old Lincolns, for these incredible Canberra airplanes, which had performance and maneuverability which was superior to the fighters of the time. So this was a culture shock for Bomber Command, and it was quite a problem for them. But in the fullness of time came the summer exercises, whereby traditionally Bomber Command would set up attacking forces coming in from the Low Countries to be intercepted by the fighter defences of this country. And it became very, very apparent that when the Canberras came in, that the Meteors weren't going to get anywhere near them. And progressively, the Canberra force was ordered to come lower and lower and lower until the Meteors could actually catch them. And they actually had to come down to about 30,000 feet before they could do that.
The Canberra went on to be another British success story, claiming many records for both speed and altitude. The type also impressed the United States Air Force, who built and operated their own versions under license as the Martin B-57. Incredibly, for an aircraft conceived as the Second World War was ending, photo reconnaissance versions are still flying with the RAF at the beginning of the 21st century. The Canberra was RAF Bomber Command's first jet bomber. In 1955, it was joined by the Vickers Valiant. The Valiant had 4 Rolls-Royce Avon turbojets and was intended to carry out long-range bombing missions. It was also the first British jet bomber to carry a nuclear bomb, which was dropped over the test range at Maralinga, Australia in October 1956. The Valiant was the first of 3 new large bombers designed to carry Britain's airborne nuclear deterrent in what became known as the V-Force. At the Coronation Review of 1953, the crowds were given a tantalizing glimpse of these extraordinary machines, the Avro Vulcan and Handley Page Victor. These aircraft were the result of the ingenuity, vision and expertise of British designers who continuously strove to push back the frontiers of knowledge in all aspects of aircraft design. An early example of the British aviation industry's imaginative thinking was the de Havilland DH-108.
The DH-108 program was to find a way of getting high performance out of a modern jet aircraft and learning all we needed to learn about the swept wing advantages. And we learnt from the 108 the immensely high performance that wing could give, but it had very serious drawbacks in that the stability of the aeroplane was not adequate for development into either a commercial airliner or military aircraft as we at that time were not able to produce artificial stability, which of course later in development of aircraft became something that was relatively normal practice.
The concept of tailless flight was also investigated by Armstrong Whitworth, who built the extraordinary-looking AW-52 in 1948.
The thing which was most outstanding was the disharmony of the controls. Laterally, the controls were very, very heavy, and fore and aft they were exceedingly light, which made it not a very pleasant aircraft to fly in that respect. And in order to attain the degree of longitudinal control necessary, not only did it have to have large elevons, but it had movable sections of wing called correctors, which were hydraulically operated, which was in fact the section of wing ahead of the elevons, which was adjustable by the pilot symmetrically to give you control over the full speed range.
During the 1940s, the quest for speed took scientists into new areas of research and design. Captured German data and the arrival of German scientists and technicians in research establishments in Britain and the United States proved to be of great help, for Germany had been much more advanced in this area of research. A number of projects were begun to look at the properties of the Delta wing with a view to building Britain's first supersonic jet fighter. The Fairey FD-2 was ordered in 1950, but didn't fly until 1954.
It really had very good all-round controllability. Unlike its predecessor, the FD-1, which was a very different animal, that was oversensitive and really quite a bit of a nightmare to fly. But we were expecting something a little bit like that when we first flew the FD-2, but it turned out to be a very gentlemanly, stable aeroplane.
Powered by a single Rolls-Royce Avon 200 turbojet, the FD-2 was destined to become the first aeroplane to fly at over 1,000 miles an hour. As the test program developed, it became apparent that an attempt at the world's absolute speed record might be possible.
But as soon as we had flown supersonically, we realized that we were flying virtually every day at beyond the existing world speed record figure. So we thought, well, if we can do this and actually do it at something in excess of 1,000 miles an hour, we'd get a lot of good publicity.
First seen by the public at Farnborough, the Fairey Delta 2 is undoubtedly the aircraft of the moment. And the pilot of the moment is Mr. Peter Twiss. He'd been flying the FD-2 at fantastic speeds for some time. But now he's off on the record-breaking...
One of the major problems was the fuel consumption. As soon as you turned on the afterburner, the fuel consumption virtually doubled, and you had to plan your flight to be very adjacent to your airfield or a friendly airfield at all times, because you probably only had about 20 minutes, if you did a supersonic flight, only about 20 minutes reserve. In fact, in the speed record flights, which were 23 minutes, we were landing with about 15 gallons of fuel, which is certainly not an acceptable amount, not enough to go around it and do a balk landing or anything. Well, I realized it was quite a successful run, but it was in fact to be the last run. We had this amazing period of fine weather in March, which is, as you know from our recent experience, not fairly unusual. And the chief engineer had decided that the aircraft had been flying for a week solidly, and he wanted to have a good look at it. So he said, right, this is the last flight.
So we knew then this is the last chance we were going to get.
Two aircraft were built and both were remarkably reliable. In 1960, the first aircraft was sent to the Bristol Aircraft Company to be modified for further research into delta wing shape.
Well, that was really again, an aeroplane for RAE, and they wanted to try and correlate their wind tunnel results with actual flight of a slender delta aeroplane, particularly in the transonic range, whereas they'd already had the little Handley Page airplane, which had a very unsophisticated slender delta wing, and other airplanes had been used. And because the FD2 was available, it was converted by the Bristol Airplane Company to this slender delta form, and as I previously said, it had other things done to make it usable in that plan. And I think it proved quite fairly conclusively that the wind tunnel tests were, as found. It was very nice to fly, and it was very limited in fuel, actually, and I think one of the biggest worry was, trying to get through a program on the limited fuel on the aircraft, although we had a little more than the FD2. But again, it was a heavier aircraft, and so things balanced out a bit. But no, it was very pleasant, really. I mean, there were certain differences. We put different flight control units in, and because the FD2 used to have a bit of lag in the system, rather. And but we improved it, but we didn't eliminate it altogether.
But with aircraft flying faster and faster, new materials were needed to build the airframes in order to cope with the stresses and heat generated by high-speed flight. In 1953, the Bristol Aircraft Company was issued with a contract to build a research vehicle capable of flying at twice the speed of sound. Designated the Type 188, it was made of stainless steel.
The objectives were to carry out research, both aerodynamic and engine development, at Mach numbers exceeding 2, which really, and to study the effects of kinetic heating, which occurs at about 2.5 onwards. At that time, the aluminium alloys were not capable of withstanding those sort of speeds, and this is why Concorde flew at 2.2 and limiting. And so they had to decide what they were going to build it with, and stainless steel at that time was the only material available. And so it was built of stainless steel, which was difficult to handle and shape and mould and every machine. So again, it didn't seem a practical proposition for future aircraft. And but the airplane itself flew beautifully. It was a very nice airplane to handle, and just as well, because we had a lot of trouble with the engine surging and so on. But we still were able to, up to a point, carry out our programs.
Arguably, one of the most extraordinary results of all the research activity that was going on during the 40s and 50s was the Hawker Harrier, which today, as the GR7, forms a vital part of the RAF's capability. The project began in 1960 as the P1127.
I can remember it fairly clearly because I was used as a bit of a guinea pig in that I was subjected to as little helicopter flying as I possibly could. In fact, I only did 3 35-minute trips in a helicopter at the Empire Test Pilot School, and then I got straight into the P1127 prototype. But one had to sort of concentrate extremely hard in those days on exactly what you were doing, because it was all new. I just had to take what I was told as being the thing to do, concentrate, and do what I was told. Completely new dimension. To be able to take the lift, the nozzle lever, pull it back, and gradually increase thrust until the airplane was fully supported on the engine. And of course, one of the most difficult aspects of the airplane was the flying controls, which of course had to work at all speeds from 600 knots right down to the hover, even flying backwards, sideways, and maneuvering. And that was a tremendous technical achievement by the design team at Hawkers. We had a lot of very clever people working on this project. And it was quite an eye-opener to be able to fly it. Privilege.
Today, the events of that post-war decade seem worlds away. In a world in which aircraft take many years to take flight, it's easy to forget that much of what we know about flying faster, higher, and further was achieved in an age before computers. It was a time when designers and pilots had to work closely together, trying things out. And if it didn't work, it was quite literally a case of going back to the drawing board and starting all over again. The dynamism of Britain's aircraft industry enabled the RAF to lead the world in many areas of aviation. What the industry lacked in financial resources and facilities was more than compensated for in talent and quality. And as the junior service gathered for its coronation review, it knew it could do so in the certainty that it was the best in the world.